Welcome to today's webinar about our brand new report from Surplus to Solutions 2025 ReFED U.S. Food Waste Report. We are looking forward to talking with you all about this and about how it came to be, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into each section with a panel of my ReFED colleagues who are going to join us in just a few minutes. And then we'll end our session with plenty of time for some Q&A. So please, as I said, drop them in. And if you're just joining us, please introduce yourself in the chat. All right, so let's get started. My name is Dana Gunders. I'm the president here at ReFED. I will also be your host today for the webinar. For those of you not familiar with ReFED, we are a US-based nonprofit working to catalyze the food system towards evidence-based action to stop wasting food. So we really rely on that data to help guide the work. The goal of ReFED's work is to increase adoption of food waste solutions. And one way that we help that is through events and webinars like this, which can help inform the work that all of you are doing. So before we get into the conversation, I do want to share a few quick announcements. First, we're extremely excited that this year we will be hosting our 2025 ReFED Food Waste Solutions Summit on June 23rd to 25th in Seattle, Washington. Registration is open, so please register. We have all sorts of things. It's a must-attend event of the year. It has field trips, presentations, workshop, networking events, and more. And you'll hear directly from leaders who are shaping our food system. And plus this year, you'll get to experience all of the energy and excitement of Seattle. We always try to make it very kind of place-based, and there are some really great field trips shaping up. And so we're excited and hopeful that we'll see many of you there. You can find additional information at summit.refed.org. And finally, this is new. We have some really exciting news from today. In addition to the report we're going to be talking about, actually today we released a different report in collaboration with Johns Hopkins and Harvard. And we are sharing the results of a consumer survey about date labels. There are a lot of really valuable stats in the report, and the key takeaway is that Americans today are actually more reliant on food date labels than they were in 2016, with 43%, this is kind of crazy, 43% of Americans always or usually are throwing food away close to or past the date on the package, even if the food is still safe and edible. So we're really excited to release this information, and specifically are doing it now because it's ahead of a March 5th deadline for the USDA and FDA's request for information on date labels. The comment period for that is open now, and we hope and encourage you to make comments, send a comment in, whether it's like one line or 3 pages, and please feel free to reference the survey that we're publishing right now as part of your comments if you feel it makes your comment stronger. All right, I think that was all of the prequel to the report. So now we are going to turn to our new report, and today we're really excited to talk about it. Excuse me. We are hoping that this is an annual report. It's kind of like a first annual report, and it takes all of the ReFED data that we have, but it combines it with data of our partners, and it's both a qualitative and quantitative analysis of food waste. And we're trying to kind of put a picture together for everyone of, what is happening, and, is progress being made, and what are kind of the latest things you need to know about what's happening on the topic and the latest data. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to see it yet, we are putting the link in the chat now. Now, there's a couple things I want to point out before we dive deeper into specific sections. This is really like a broad report. It's meant for all different stakeholders. It takes a look at key trends happening now, has the latest statistics, and we did lean on Well, we did use much of our most up-to-date food waste data, but it also draws on the work of many others, including EPA, Harvard, NRDC, Biocycle, and more. So I do want to thank them and many others who are in the report in one way or another for contributing and for the work that you're all doing. And with that, let's dive into the numbers themselves. All right, so to start, here are our latest estimates on surplus food. As you can see, in 2023, 31% of food produced in the US went unsold or uneaten. And if it were to translate to a dollar value, it would be worth $382 billion. To put that in perspective, that is about 1.4% of the US total GDP for that year. For longtime followers of our data, you'll notice that these numbers are a bit lower than the ones that we've published in the past. And I want to talk about why that is. For anyone who has worked with models or data to generate estimates, you'll know that it's kind of like part art and part science. We weave together a lot of different data sets to try to estimate all the information that you can find on the ReFED Insights engine and other places where we are putting out information. And some of that data, some of those data sets we're using change annually. And wherever we can, we use those. But in other areas, there are data sets that are maybe, one snapshot that happened at a certain point in time. And they're not necessarily updated every year. And so in this case, the change in our statistics can actually be attributed to the fact that our data is getting better, specifically for our residential numbers. And sorry to get a little wonky for a second, but I do think it's important to understand. Previously, our consumer data had always been based on the USDA's data set that's called the Loss Adjusted Food Availability Data Set. Say that, 5 times fast. But that data set was actually based on 2012 data and had not been updated since. Meanwhile, we have great partners over at Ohio State with Brian Rowe and the Recipes Network team who have been implementing a survey of consumers that happens 3 times a year and is planning to happen, for the next several years at least. And so we adjusted our methodology to be able to use their information. And that is going to allow us to track progress on a year-to-year basis in a much more effective way. So you can read more about the methodology behind this change in the link that's being dropped in the chat. But I think the important thing to know is that we are always trying to make our data better, and we're pretty excited to be making this change this year. And I guess the other thing to say is we think that these estimates are more accurate, if that wasn't clear already. Okay, so now to the question that I know many of you are wondering about, which is, are we making progress? So here we see the full scope of surplus food generation since 2016, which is the baseline that the US goals have been set on. And, I think the obvious thing you see is that in 2020, there was a big dip as businesses were closing, et cetera. But you can also see that there's been a steady increase since then. And now we've returned to the baseline amount that we were at in 2016. Now, no one would rather see those last few bars go down more than I would. But when I combine this picture with all the pockets of progress that I know are out there, the takeaway here for me is not that progress is not happening. It's that a very large ship is starting to turn, right? And the good news is that surplus food has not risen since 2016 either. In fact, when you consider the population has gone up, it's actually gone down per capita by about 2%. It's also, I think, true, and we'll talk about in a moment kind of some of the little areas of progress that we are seeing. And I think it can take a while for those to really register in our model estimates. And so I also believe that in some ways there may be progress that we're not capturing. All right, so just to give you a little bit more on kind of what our numbers say is the state of things, where is all this surplus food going? So here you can see a comprehensive breakdown of all the destinations where surplus food is ending up. And you can see that most is still ending up in waste destinations, with landfill being the top waste destination. And we'll talk a little bit more about donation rates and what might be coming in the future around those as well during our panel. Also, there are of course impacts with all of this food that's going on in. And so when you look at it, when it comes to quantifying the emissions, they're equivalent to driving about 54 million cars per year. In terms of water use, everyone in the US would have to take a shower 7 times a day to reach the amount of fresh water that is required to grow all of the food that ends up not being eaten. And lastly, of course, there is the fact that this is good food that is going to waste. And this quantity of food equates to about 120 billion meals worth of food, which is truly an astonishing number. When it comes to our solutions model, I want to highlight that we've updated along with the problem, we've updated all of our solutions model with this update. And so taken all together, our estimate is that if our solutions, all 45 of them were implemented across the country fully, that would create up to 50,000 jobs over a 10-year period and divert 18 million tons of food away from waste destinations annually. Aggregating all the costs and benefits across stakeholders, a $16 billion investment, a $16 billion investment would be required, but it would result in a net financial benefit of 61 billion, which is nearly a 4-to-1 return. To help visualize kind of all the solutions and how effective they are, we've updated an abatement cost curve, which may look familiar to those of you who have been with ReFED since 2016, and when that roadmap was published. This shows solutions arranged from left to right, from most to least cost effective per ton. Now, I know you can't read the details here, so please go to the report to see them. But what if you kind of squint your eyes, you can see that prevention and recovery solutions, which fall over here on the left side of the chart, offer a greater bang for buck when you consider them at the society level. Whereas recycling solutions on the right side require just a lot more major capital infrastructure, but they can also handle much bigger volumes of waste material. So please take a look at that chart more closely. The good news is that, as I said, we are seeing indicators of progress, and the business sector is one area that we are seeing them. We're thrilled that this past year we were able to report, after 4 years of collecting data with the Pacific Coast Food Waste Commitment and the food retailers that were involved with that, they reported a reduction in unsold food by 25%. And kind of due to the success of that West Coast project, we launched a national project just a little over a year ago and already have significant representation. We have 50% of retailers' grocery market share represented and 27% of food service. And we're just thrilled with the amount of interest and energy there is around that. And relatedly, that there are 20 of the top 65 companies that have now stated a commitment to reducing food loss and waste. So there really is interest in that business sector. We are also seeing funding and policy movement between government and private investment. There's over 900 million that was invested in 2024 into food waste reduction. And on the policy side, there were over 100 state and federal bills introduced in 2023 and 2024. One of those was a bill to standardize date labels in California that passed, which is a first of its kind law, and we believe it will really set precedents across the country that will hopefully reduce all the confusion around date labels that's leading to food being thrown out. And we know our hope is really that that can lead to federal action, though we know already that several other states are thinking of introducing similar laws this year. Also, as of right now, in total, 12 states have some kind of organic waste ban or restriction on food going to their landfills. And not only that, but some that have had them for a while, we're seeing progress. So Vermont has actually reduced its food waste by 13%. Per their analysis, and California has reached 95% of its goal to recover edible food, to recover 20% of edible food that goes uneaten, and 91% of its goal around organics waste collection. So that's exciting to see too. And let's not forget that last year, the national strategy to reduce food loss and waste was introduced. We were really excited to see that come out and hope that at least some of what's in there will continue into this new administration. All right, we also, I think it's a slightly less tangible, but I really feel a real sense of progress around what's happening in media and research. We've seen, almost 180,000 articles that came out just last year alone in the media. But in terms of academic articles, there were about 5,000. Now that is up from just 1,000 in 2016. So there's been a lot more research over the last 9, I guess it is, years. And I think just a lot more attention really to the topic. We've also seen an increase in online searches, and that's exciting because hopefully that means that not only are kind of practitioners looking at this, but also that everyday Americans are thinking about this topic, trying to learn about it, and maybe trying to learn what to change in their own lives. Okay, so with that kind of broader introduction of some of the numbers, I do want to invite some of my colleagues up to really get into more detail. And talk about kind of what is the current state of food waste in the US. And, in broad strokes, we've seen increases in awareness and commitments and everything we just went over. So let's start to get into kind of, is it progress? What are the trends we're seeing, and a little bit more. To help me break that down, we've got 4 of my really incredible colleagues from the ReFED team. We have Alejandro Enamorado, our Senior Manager of Capital Initiatives. Alejandro works on tracking funding in the food waste space, and those of you in the food waste funder circle may know him as your main contact. We've also got David Lee, our Senior Manager of Business Initiatives. David works with food businesses through our business service program, which helps businesses reduce food waste in their operations through a number of data-driven tools. We have Minnie Ringland. She's our Manager of Climate and Insights. Minnie is our climate expert for sure, and her work supports several of the tools in our insights engine, including the impact calculator, which we recently updated to include insights from our methane report that came out last September. And rounding it all out for our all-star panel here is Angel Vesa, who is our Director of Innovation Initiatives. Some of you might know Angel as the lead of our Catalytic Grant Fund, and she works with both food businesses and solution providers to accelerate solution adoption. So we have a stellar panel here. Please welcome them. And of course, there are many other ReFEDers who have been working on this report and all this work. So I extend a huge thanks to them, even though we can't have them all on the call today. All right, so to get going, let's start with you, Minnie. I want to kind of ask you for just a little bit more commentary on some of what I just said. We're seeing a lot of activity, but we're not seeing clear results across the board. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the levels of surplus food and if there are any kind of seeds of progress that you're seeing?
There we go. Thanks, Dana. Yeah, I mean, at the risk of being redundant with all of the statistics you've shared, I think public salience of the food waste issue has really risen, and we're seeing a lot more research, more policies, more funding, more commitments, and so on. And I think when we look around the country, there are these shining stars, examples of progress in pilots and case studies, city and state level action. But it kind of reminds me of chemistry 101 in some ways, where all this hard work is really still building up the activation energy. And I think we're really close to that brink of pushing the reaction into reality, where we can scale and replicate what's really a national movement. And part of the challenge is that change requires a lot of collaboration across the food system, which is hard. And so there's still a lot more to be done. From a data perspective, which is where my head is at most days, I think the best news that we can share is kind of what you mentioned. Our estimates are getting more and more accurate. The better we are able to reflect progress over time, the better data we have collectively, the better equipped we are to really target the problem and get at root causes of food waste. So, maybe I'll stop there in terms of specific success stories. There really is a lot to learn from, and I'll leave it there. The rest of the team is better equipped to share those highlights.
Mm-hmm. And what about cost, right? There are a lot of factors that go into the cost and can be considered. Can you explain a little bit more about kind of what exactly the value of surplus food is and how higher food prices these days are increasing that cost?
Yeah, so those top line value numbers that we publish are they're the value of surplus food had it been sold as intended. So it's about $120 billion worth of lost revenue from producers, manufacturers, retailers, and food service operators. It's $108 billion if you exclude farm losses. And then on top of that, consumers spend $261 billion on groceries and restaurant leftovers that they don't end up eating, which is really astounding. And it comes out to almost $800 per person each year. And I think that's particularly concerning as we consider rising food prices, which we think may continue to increase as tariffs and labor shortages play out. And all of that interplays with rising food insecurity.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's, oh yeah.
Oh, good.
Well, that's the value of the food, and that doesn't even capture the costs that are associated with waste disposal and food waste management. So we spend some time in the report talking about things like employee training, transportation costs, and things like that. And then the final hidden cost that I really want to highlight is something that is called the social cost of carbon. So essentially, there's this externalized cost to the emissions that contribute to climate change. Heat waves, droughts, and other weather extremes create damages, such as lost crops and destroyed buildings. And then there's a higher energy demand for things like air conditioning, higher rates of hospitalization, especially for vulnerable populations. And these all tend to be social costs that are borne by the public. So if you attribute the portion of those costs that come from surplus foods emissions, it comes out to $47 million in 2023 alone, which I think is staggering.
Yeah. Wow, that's a lot. Yeah, and I think something interesting we did, and we've kind of a little bit of a switch in how we're capturing things is that we've actually started looking at the cost of food in restaurants that people buy but don't eat as a consumer cost, right? Because that's what it is. It's not really a cost to the restaurant at that point, it's cost to us. And I think that's been a little bit of a shift in our mentality around like, when are we talking about consumers and when are we talking about businesses, and where are where is that lost value? Yeah. Okay, let's dig into climate impact since you are our climate queen here. We can't let you get away without that. So a huge part of this conversation is, and why a lot of people are working on this is because we believe it to be a climate solution. And last year, you worked on a report that quantified specifically the methane emissions from surplus food. That report determined that 14% of methane emissions in the US comes from surplus food. With our new adjusted data, we're actually estimating that to be about 10%. But what else do we need to be thinking about beyond greenhouse gas emissions as well?
Sure. So I don't want to minimize the emissions associated with surplus food. Greenhouse gases are emitted all along the supply chain from farm to fork, and then afterwards as well, particularly if the food ends up in a landfill or a sewer system. And it's a significant contribution to the country's annual footprint. And as I just mentioned, there are a lot of serious costs associated with that. But there are other related and pressing environmental issues that we shouldn't neglect to include in the conversation. And you highlighted some of those statistics earlier, but the water required, for example, to grow surplus food represents 16% of the country's annual freshwater usage. And the land required to grow that food also represents 16% of the country's total cropland. And just to give a visual of that, if it was one big mega farm that surplus food was being grown on, it would be the size of California and New York State combined. Water conservation as an issue is really urgent, particularly in California where I live. And actually, some of you may know that water efficiency in agriculture is how Dana herself got introduced to the issue of food waste. So the data that's available there is also about a decade old. And so one area of research that we're hoping to explore this year is improving those sources around the water usage by surplus food. And then making the best use of existing agricultural land in order to prevent conversion and clearing of native ecosystems is one of the clearest ways that we can help protect biodiversity, both in the US, from land conversion that's taking place and in other countries based on the food that we import into this country. So the link to biodiversity is something we're also really interested in exploring this year.
Yeah, for sure. Great. All right. Thank you, Minnie. We will come back to you in a bit, but I want to move on now to talk a little bit about food businesses. So, David, all right, we talked a little bit about public commitments, and I think, it's exciting to hear that, almost a third of leading food businesses have a public commitment. That's awesome. I think also people have a little skepticism around commitments being just that and not more. So what I'd really like to talk to you about are like kind of that interplay between external expectations and those commitments that are being made and then the internal strategies. So how are food businesses aligning some of that external stuff with internal strategies to reduce waste? And also the kind of the pressures, right? I mean, it's not just their commitments, they also have these external factors that are pushing on them as well. So maybe you could touch on that too.
Yeah, thanks, Dana. I'll start with the trends and go into what we're seeing leading businesses do. So with the trends, you mentioned regulations. So the EU and other countries, municipalities are starting to really require food waste diversion and measurement programs. And sustainability teams in food businesses are responsible for meeting those requirements. But as many of you on the call know, you're pulled in so many different directions, right? And you have to balance these evolving regulations with your own business objectives. So how do leading businesses get started on this journey? How do they find that balance? And what we've seen is that they're proactive first and foremost. And they're proactive starting with measurement and setting goals. They establish data-driven insights, even where regulation doesn't require them to do so. And as a result, many naturally gravitate toward this target, measure, act approach we see in pre-competitive groups like the U.S. Food Waste Pact. And, it's not just the measurement side of things. We know that there's this organizational change and transformation needed to reduce food waste. And leading businesses make sure at every step in the process and engaging at all different levels, both internally and with supply chain partners, they're sharing data, building the business case with leadership and their cross-functional teams. And from there, they build momentum by empowering frontline employees. We have some great case studies on that on the PCFWC website. And they strengthen their partnerships with suppliers. So beyond meeting regulatory requirements, the businesses always have kind of a clear vision of where their food waste reduction goals support their company's mission. But they don't only do that. They don't want to just cut costs, but they really reinforce how their value proposition matches to customers and their employees, matches the need to reduce food waste. So to close out, you mentioned how are things going for signatories of the PCFWC. We saw, as you mentioned, a 25% reduction from 2019 to 2022. And we have the annual report upcoming in the next month. And we expect businesses to really maintain their recent success.
All right, I like the teaser. Stay tuned. Next month, we will have some updates on those on those numbers. Super. Well, thank you. And let's just talk a little bit about donations specifically. Um, like oftentimes, well, certainly from the hierarchy or now the waste of food scale, we see, people prioritize, we want them to be prioritizing donating food, right? After they've prevented all that they can. So but there's often a lot of logistical challenges. Um, what's working in the donation space?
Yeah, there's no way to really prevent all of the food to waste in the supply chain, and there's always going to be this pool of food that can be donated. And I'll start by sharing like kind of the scale of the food that is donated and what the opportunity looks like. So we saw about 1.75 million tons of surplus food donated in 2023, and that's great. Many of you working in food banks and food recovery organizations are doing great work here, but there's still this challenge because only 12% of the food that can be donated actually reaches people in need. So how are businesses and food recovery partners addressing this? Well, what we've seen and what we see as an opportunity is as an area like to improve that number is to really share data and like develop that partnership. So sharing data, best practices, reinforcing the supply chain to support food recovery with improved technology, both on the software and hardware side. And we've also seen that, with the investment in time and resources needed to support those investments, more businesses can and should recognize that there's this triple bottom line benefit to the climate, to people, financially to them by elevating the awesome opportunity to get tax deductions and incentives for donating their food. So we're really going to be seeing more resources out there in the near future on our end, and hope that for those of you on the call who are working to work in food recovery and help those in need get their food, I think there's going to be this balance act between preventing the food and donating it, and we're excited to see what happens next.
Yeah, that's great. And I love, I think oftentimes I've noticed businesses will go from donating kind of one product that maybe feels easier, one product category that feels a little easier, one or two, and then they kind of start to look at, oh, can we donate, wait, can we donate yogurt? That's packaged, or, and then they've opened the refrigerated door and they figure out how to do a bunch of those. And it's kind of fun when you see that they're when they figure they kind of crack that nut, and then it opens the door for just like a whole new range of donations. Super. Okay. Well, thank you, David. Minnie, back to you for just a moment. We have got great momentum from businesses, as we just heard from David, but we also know that the residential sector is still the one that wastes the most food. Certainly, if you think about it, along with our adding in the cost to consumers of out-of-home food waste as well, they really become the largest sector, even more so. So kind of, can you just talk a little bit more about how how that is happening right now? I think a lot of people have this question around inflation and higher food prices, which we would intuitively think would incentivize consumers to waste less. I think even we were a little bit surprised to see that wasn't really panning out in our numbers. So why is that? Like, why are we still seeing consumers waste more, even though those food prices are getting higher and higher?
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, and digging into this question gave our team a fun opportunity to try on our like behavioral psychologist hats. But the research seems to indicate that rather than just making the best use of what people are buying, they look for other ways to save money, like by switching away from name brands. And what's particularly concerning, as you mentioned, is that the Ohio State survey data shows that consumers are actually wasting more than ever, even before the pandemic. And Dana, I always love your visual of dropping one out of your 3 shopping bags in the grocery store parking lot on the way to your car. I think it's so visceral. And I wonder if, because food waste in our homes is so mentally and physically removed from the shopping experience, that's why we see this disconnect. So a really great survey that MITRE and Gallup conducted in 2023 revealed that only a third of Americans realize how much money they're throwing away in the form of wasted food. And the same survey found that people who identify themselves as sort of leftover eaters produced nearly 4 times less food waste than those who identified as non-leftovers eaters. And people who toss food past its date label produced more than twice as much waste as people who relied more on their senses to make sure that the food was still good to eat. So I think there's a lot of potential in better educating consumers around the behaviors that can save food and save money at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. I saw it last night. On the plane home, the lady who sat next to me was there with like 4 bags, and one of them was her leftovers from lunch. And she sat down and she was just like, "Oh my God, these were such a pain to carry, but it just saved me $17." And and I was like, "Oh." That was kind of a fun moment. All right, so let's turn now to think about funding a little bit. Now, Alejandra and Angel, you kind of both come at this from different angles. Alejandra, let's start with you. Funding has been down over the last several years in general, and that, of course, affects this space as well. What do you think needs to happen to get it back up, and like where might that money come from? And if we get it, what is it going to accomplish?
That's a pretty big question, Dana. Thank you for that. And so I think it's helpful to talk about how we got here. Given the food waste space or the food waste solution space is quite early stage and emerging, a lot of that funding is from venture capital. And so those funders are actually, I would say, quite fickle. They move on to the next thing, and I'll probably talk a bit more about that later. But I think that broad decline data that you talked about has definitely affected food waste. One bright spot that I do want to mention is that philanthropy has been increasing in supporting food waste solutions. And so that's something that's been really positive that I've seen over the past number of years. To your question about what needs to happen to get funding back up, this is both, I would say, like on the business side as well as the funder side. On the business side, I'd say we need to see more scaling of proven return on investment startups as well as high impact nonprofits, whether it's adoption from businesses. I know there are a lot of champions that, David, you talked about, but I think we need broader adoption to be able to say these are the case studies of solution providers that are making a big difference, because I think that will get the traditional capital back into looking at food waste solutions. The other end of that I want to talk about, which is on the funder side, is we internally at ReFED, we've come to the conclusion that I think there's been a bit of misunderstanding about how you can deploy capital for food waste solutions. And that's largely because the problem is so complex. You need to engage so many different players that it's not like you're going to deploy money and the problem will be solved in 3 years. The timeline is much longer. And so we think that there needs to be more patient capital. We call it catalytic capital, but that includes philanthropy, which we were already seeing a lot more coming in. So that's a positive, but we need to see impact investors looking at this, as well as government granting has also been another strong element of it over the past, and we hope to see some continued focus there, but that has also been something that has been able to unlock further funding. What do we hope to actually get from all of this funding coming in? Honestly, it's going to be a few things. One is, again, scaled startups, scaled solution providers that we can point to and say, hey, they're really solving a problem. But I also don't want to forget that the problem is local. So we want to see also full coverage across, whether it's local or regional coverage, because I think that's also a big thing that's affecting how people, both businesses and individuals, address the food waste issue, is that maybe they just lack solutions to go to. And so we're hoping for greater coverage as well when it comes to having this funding out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that coverage point and that local point is really interesting, because it is about scaling is about replicating in a lot of ways. It's not about a tech thing that just everybody all of a sudden adopts. It's like, nope, this worked here. Now let's have it work here. Let's have it work here. A couple years ago, I kind of made a big point of how milk dispensers in schools are so effective and they should just be in every school, right? And I went on a little learning journey to try to figure out, like, all right, well, great. Can we just get grants and deploy? How much would it cost, right? Let's just like raise the money and have milk dispensers in all the schools. But of course, it's not that simple because every school, literally every school, has some say in what equipment they have on site and whatnot. So you actually have to convince every school in America to buy one of those. It's not like you can just deploy, right? And so I think there are some solutions that you can just, really look to scale or look at some of the big businesses to scale. But then there are others that it is more of a replicating and picking it up kind of thing. Thank you. Thank you for all those insights, Alejandro. And Angel, I know you're having a lot of thoughts as he's saying that, because you really come at this from partly from that solution provider angle, which, by the way, for those of you who don't kind of speak ReFED yet, we use that term solution provider to talk about all of the organizations that are providing solutions, whether they are for-profit, nonprofit, in the space. So Angel, related to that, collaboration is really important. Alejandro was just talking about some of that, but what examples have you seen where solution providers are working with businesses and funders together to unlock meaningful food waste reduction?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give two examples. I'll give one first on maybe the nonprofit side and looking at food rescue. So one relevant example, I think, is Food Rescue U.S. So they're a nonprofit organization that coordinates pickups of surplus food and then helps get it to food insecure families throughout the United States. So ReFED's Catalytic Grant Fund actually provided funding to Food Rescue U.S. to develop this API endpoint, and it seamlessly integrates with restaurants' POS and inventory management systems. And this is really important because what this will unlock is the opportunity specifically for independent restaurants. So these are not your large scaled national chains or anything like that. These are those more local mom and pop restaurants to schedule food donations effortlessly. I think about it like the DoorDash for food rescue, right? And so the key collaboration here, though, is actually with Toast, which is a point of sale system, and Toast.org, which is their philanthropic arm, and they were actually the anchor funder for the grant fund. So this whole collaboration actually enabled Food Rescue US to integrate with Toast's platform and pilot this feature with restaurants in Detroit and Baltimore. So this pilot is now going to unlock this opportunity for food rescue to scale to independent restaurants across the nation. And again, that's been a very specific restaurant type that's been difficult to reach. On the for-profit side, I think a good example, again, talking about local, is this company called Local Line. So it's this local food sourcing platform for farmers and food hubs and buyers. And so they received an investment from Cultivate Next, and that's actually Chipotle's venture arm. And this investment actually allowed Local Line to digitize their operations, improve customer retention, and then expand internationally. But this growth really positioned Local Line to work in tandem with Chipotle and help them meet their local sourcing goals. So I think this really demonstrates how strategic funding can accelerate impact and align with businesses' sustainability objectives. So I think these examples really highlight how funders, businesses, and solution providers can all collaborate to really unlock food waste reduction at scale.
Yeah, and I love, I will say we, as Angel's mentioning, host this catalytic grant fund, and I think we really try to find that we take that catalytic part very seriously, right? And like, where are those places where we can really it's not happening otherwise, and it's a really good idea. And we also try to make those connections when we can for the grantees, because that's sometimes as important, in that collaboration model. Okay, great examples. What are you seeing more kind of as trends with solution providers and innovation?
So we highlight a number of trends like AI and automation and decentralized recycling and using feedstocks as bio-based materials, all in the report. So definitely check that out. But looking ahead, I think we'll see innovation emerge across all solution areas. And so I'll start first with prevention. And I think we're going to see innovations respond to pressing needs for food businesses, specifically around food safety. So a major bottleneck, right, is testing food for dangerous pathogens like E. coli and Salmonella, but these tests take 3 to 7 days or longer. And so food is just sitting in cold storage. It's a huge bottleneck, and it can contribute to waste. So in response to this, there are emerging solutions like Snap DNA that are rapidly testing for pathogens, but at the molecular level, and then using predictive analytics to identify potential contamination risks before they even occur, right? So now we're streamlining our operations. And then I think we'll also see innovation help solutions expand to other product areas. So in terms of shelf life extension, as an example, most solutions address produce, but we're now seeing innovative packaging technologies like fresher technologies designed to extend the shelf life of proteins like seafood. And so that's helping to reduce spoilage in high value products. And we're also seeing companies like Velour specifically for the beef industry. And what they do is they actually support optimal sorting and cutting and butchering decisions so that we're actually maximizing the beef carcass throughout the entire value chain. So again, really shifting more to looking at proteins. And then in terms of food rescue, I think we'll continue to see a growing number of organizations launch new innovative earned revenue models, specifically around processing food and then selling it to food buyers. And then lastly, with recycling, I think there's a clear need for innovation in sorting and decontamination to create cleaner waste streams for solutions like composting and just improve overall waste diversion efforts. So lots of opportunities looking ahead across these areas.
Yeah, wow. Okay, I did not know about that Snap DNA thing. We are going to talk after this because that is like my dream come true. We'll put a pin in that for now. Okay, we are going to turn to questions in just a second. I do just want to mention that in the last part of the report, we really close out with kind of an outlook on 2025, right? And what are kind of we anticipating are going to be some of the big forces that shape this year in our world. And I won't go into detail, but I will just say, some of the things we're really tracking are AI, as Angel mentioned, which I think we're pretty optimistic will be helpful, generally speaking, in all the different ways it can be applied. GLP-1s, those are like those Ozempic drugs, are like a tidal wave hitting the industry right now, and they are impacting how much people are buying, what they are buying, what they are craving, how they are dining out, what size of portions they want when they dine out, right? And so, possibly creating a much bigger segment of consumers who are looking for smaller portion sizes or flexible, to the option to buy smaller portion sizes, and really making the business case for businesses to start serving those in a way that maybe they haven't had that market segment before. We expect food prices to continue to rise, which is not great on the whole, but frankly does help justify some of the investment in this topic and hopefully reach consumers eventually, even though we know that's not really happening. It's not a strategy they're practicing right now. We expect volatility in funding to continue, especially as policy feels quite volatile right now as well. And I think I'll just say a few words there because I'm sure people have kind of thoughts and questions on that. And that is that, on the federal level, when we're kind of observing what's happening right now, the key influences that we think will come from it, although I'm sure there are more that we're not thinking about, but certainly proposed tariffs, potential labor shortages in the food industry due to immigration crackdowns, those will raise the food prices even more. Also just data for us, certainly lack of staffing, hard to access data will undoubtedly have an impact on trying to keep tabs on the issue and then research it too, if research funding gets cut. We are optimistic though about continued strong action at the state level. And it's also a farm bill year. And this is likely, given the, trifecta, the year the farm bill will get done. And we do think that, this is very much still a nonpartisan issue, right? Nobody wants to see food wasted. That we regularly see support from both sides of the aisle. And we actually expect this to potentially be an area that does you know, achieve some steps and some strides within the Farm Bill. And we're fortunate to see it as a place where we can make progress, given all the volatility that's happening. So I'll just park that and turn to all of the many questions that have come in that we will not have time for. Let's see. Let's start on manufacturers helping consumers waste less. So the question is, what are your thoughts on shifts from the manufacturing side that would reduce waste on the household level? For example, is it portion sizes that stores are people are packaging stuff that are leading to residential food waste? Who wants to take that one? Minnie, do you have a thought there? David, from the manufacturing side?
I mean, yeah, I think you mentioned like packaging decisions that, you know, Angel worked on a report a couple of years ago that was really interesting about the way that you can portion packages. So like, for example, buying meat in sort of individual portion sizes so that the package can tear apart and you can put some in your freezer and just cook one portion at a time. Sort of like sustainable materials that are you know, breathable or designed in a way that mimic sort of the natural environment that food usually does well in. I think those are really interesting. So I'll let David and Angel chime in.
I'll just build on that quickly. Many of those are great examples. I think the other one that I would add to are some of the solutions you've been seeing that kind of helps provide freshness indicators for the consumer, right? So those packaging solutions that help a consumer understand where it's at so they can feel confident in their decisions in terms of purchasing and eating it and how quickly they need to eat it.
Okay, and somewhat similar here. Thinking about recommendations for businesses, what are the supply chain takeaways from this work? Are there steps suppliers should be taking to mitigate waste before it gets to the retail level? And I'm gonna, well, no, David, why don't you take that actually?
Yeah, I'd say first start by understanding how you can work with your not only upstream supplier partners, so like, you know, farms, but with retailers, because there are retailers that are out there trying to work with their suppliers to identify trends in their food waste and facilitate solutions from the retailer side in partnership with their supplier partners. So don't make it all about what you can do within your four walls. Reach out across the supply chain to solve this problem as a manufacturer.
Yeah, great. And actually, to add on to that, any tips? Says, I know one of the biggest challenges with food shelf owners is the access to technology, and kind of solutions getting into retailers, some of those technology solutions getting into retailers. So any advice on breaking that barrier?
I can quickly chime in. I think what we've seen really be helpful is just piloting as much as you can, because the lot of these solutions, these tech solutions, they need pilots in order to really validate their solution and help increase adoption. And so at any opportunity you have to engage with a solution provider and test in a few locations, just to get that momentum and that feedback and refine collaboratively, that will really help, I think, unlock that opportunity for adoption.
Great. Okay, there are a number of questions about consumers here. One is around consumer education campaigns and good examples of those, and educating consumers specifically to prevent more than to compost, even if they are composting. And also just kind of teaching cooking skills. So maybe I will take that and just say, one of the questions is examples of consumer campaigns that have worked well. There are actually a lot, which is really encouraging, to be honest, that like consumers do respond to this. And honestly, I think this is the perfect time to be conducting those. One I'll highlight is out of Ohio. the SWACO. It's like, I don't know what it stands for off the top of my head, but they have implemented a whole campaign there. They've done research. It's, been reducing waste by like 29%. EPA has actually taken 5 different campaigns that are out there and uploaded them into a toolkit on their site that hopefully is still there, and that you can access and actually use those campaigns in your own communities. And the EPA, as part of the national strategy, also did they opened a grant for a large consumer education campaign that would be a national campaign that would really kind of like provide the assets for communities to then pick up and use, and not just communities, but grocers and other food businesses. It is unclear right now if that funding will move forward or not, so I guess stay tuned on that. But absolutely, I mean, I think consumers do respond to education. I think it can be a little complicated to message around prevention and compost in the same campaign, but we have seen places do it. Alameda County comes to mind for me. And yes, we absolutely need to teach our children cooking skills. Knowledge is, cooking knowledge, kitchen knowledge is definitely one of the components of helping people waste less, the more skills they have in the kitchen. Okay, let's see. I think, oh geez, we have time for like one or two more questions here. All right, so what would the incentive be for restaurants to reduce portion sizes? How do cost savings measure up against the revenue, the gain that they see from increasing the portion sizes? And has there been any research to do this? Oh my gosh, did I plant this question or what? We are trying to do research. We're actually in the middle of a research project with the Culinary Institute of America and Georgetown to try to research this very question. Like, is there a business case for offering smaller portion sizes? Now, I want to be really clear when I say that. I think the question is, do you have a half sandwich alongside your full sandwich? Do you have a baby burrito, in addition to offering a big burrito? I think when you look at it straight, it is a challenging thing to make a business case for, because the cost of food is not that expensive, and the businesses can, recover a lot more. They can make a lot more profit if they have a bigger portion they sell for more money. However, I think that's where these GLP-1s come in, and this whole market segment question, because I think more and more we are going to see consumers avoiding establishments, that a certain segment of consumers avoiding establishments where they cannot get the portion that they are looking for, and that in fact it could become a competitive advantage for some businesses to be offering smaller portions, because those will be the go-to places for that segment, which by the way exists without GLP-1s too, right? I'm sure we could all name people who we know who tend to not finish their meals. So that, and oh my goodness, there was a great government question, but unfortunately, which is kind of big, and the role of government, and I will say that is a big question. And I think there are many things that governments can do, local, state, and federal, and there's some great resources out there. So maybe shoot us a note and we'll try to hook you up with those, whoever sent that question in. I'm sorry we didn't have time for more, but thank you all for joining, for hanging in all the way to the end here. And yes, with that, I want to thank all of our panelists, Alejandro, David, Minnie, Angel, for joining us today. These guys have such incredible expertise. They are like the backbone of ReFED, so thank you all. And everyone else from the ReFED team who contributed to making this report happen, this webinar happen. And again, for all of you, for your interest, your time, and all the work that I know you're doing. All right, take care, everyone.